Just looks like you went to the beach and tried panning for gold. You went to beach anywhere, just looks like sand. None of that pays the bills. Doesn't look like there's any gold in here. Everyone told Parker Schnabel to stay away from it. An old Trommel abandoned for nearly a decade, rusting in the Yukon wilderness. The miners who left it behind had given up on this ground entirely. But Parker saw something they missed. If you work out the ounces that we think are here across the years that are here, we have to do, 10,000+ ounces a year. And when his crew finally got that forgotten machine running again, it didn't just save their season. It uncovered a layer of gold that previous operations had been walking over for 50 years without ever knowing it was there. 83.0 from ground everyone swore was worthless. This is how it happened. In the pressure. The Yukon doesn't care about your reputation. It doesn't care how many ounces you've pulled in previous seasons. It doesn't care how many records you've broken or how many magazine covers you've been on. The ground gives what it gives. And lately, it hadn't been giving Parker much of anything worth celebrating. The last 3 cleanups had been brutal. I'm sorry to make you guys do that for that. Now we know. It's not the way we want to start off the year. No, it's a bit problematic, isn't it? Especially considering how far we have to go. Numbers that should have been climbing kept falling short week after week. The crew could feel the tension building with every disappointing weigh-in. They were burning through thousands of gallons of diesel, paying wages for a full crew and watching precious daylight hours slip away with not nearly enough gold to show for any of it. The last few cleanups were kind of bad, Parker admitted. The frustration visible in his voice and written across his face. We're still very short on gold and very short on time. Short on time was an understatement. The Yukon mining season is brutally brief. You get maybe 5 months between thaw and freeze up to make an entire year's income. Every single day counts. Every hour matters. And right now, Parker was watching his season slip through his fingers like water through a SLES box. The crew felt it, too. Mitch Blaschke, Parker's head mechanic and one of the most experienced members of the operation, had been around long enough to recognize the signs. When cleanup numbers start dropping, morale follows right behind. Guys start second-guessing decisions. Small problems become big arguments. The whole operation can spiral if you don't find a way to turn things around fast. Brennan Ruo had been running test holes across the property for weeks, searching for any sign of better ground. I'm starting to get extremely frustrated, looking around. Matt's got a bucket in the air half the day waiting for this rock truck. Breakdown after breakdown after breakdown, and this was killing us. Most of what he found was disappointing. Decent color here and there, but nothing that justified the cost of moving the entire operation. Then he found something interesting in the last place anyone expected. There's an area about 40 miles out, Brennan told Parker one evening. Old ground. 2 different operations worked it back in the 70s and 80s. Everyone assumes it's tapped out. Parker had heard about that section. Every miner in the area knew the stories. 2 separate crews had run that ground decades ago, and both had eventually walked away. The assumption was they'd taken everything worth taking. But here's the thing, Brandon continued. I pulled some samples from about 8 feet below where they were working. The old-timers were chasing big nuggets. Their equipment was basic. I don't think they could catch anything smaller than a pea. He handed Parker a test pan. The bottom was coated with fine gold. Not chunky pieces, but consistent color spread across the entire surface. Parker studied the pan for a long moment. You're telling me they missed this? I'm telling you their recovery methods couldn't catch it. This stuff would have washed right through their sloughs. It's been sitting there ever since, just waiting for someone with better equipment to come back for it. It was a gamble, a huge one. Moving operations to abandoned ground meant pulling resources away from known cuts. It meant betting weeks of the season on samples that might not represent the whole area. It meant risking everything on dirt that 2 previous operations had already given up on. Mitch didn't sugarcoat his concerns when Parker gathered the crew to explain the plan. We're talking about ground that's been written off for decades, Mitch said. If those samples don't hold across the whole cut, we're done. We won't hit our goal. Simple as that. Parker nodded slowly. I know the risk, but I also know we're not going to hit our goal running the ground we're on now. Sometimes you have to bet on something everyone else has given up on. The crew exchanged glances. This was either going to save their season or bury it. Get the equipment ready, Parker said. We're moving out tomorrow. In the breakdown, the crew mobilized before dawn. Tyson Lee fired up the D10 dozer and started cutting a new haul road into the abandoned section, carving a path through terrain that hadn't seen heavy equipment in years. The excavators followed behind, stripping away the overburden layer by layer while the rest of the crew prepped the wash plant for the new material. The first test pans from the cut looked exactly like Brennan's samples. Color in every pan. Consistent fine gold spread through the pay dirt at concentrations that got better the deeper they went. For the first time in weeks, there was actual optimism in camp. Coming off of a 30 ounces to 120. Beautiful. Well, guys, high five on that. This is exactly what I was hoping to see, Parker said, crouching beside a loaded pan. The old guys were digging right on top of this and never knew it was here. They literally walked away from a fortune. Chris Hoy grinned as he watched the excavator bucket bite into the pay layer. Maybe we should send them a thank you card. The crew laughed. It was the first time anyone had laughed in days. Things were finally looking up. Then everything fell apart. Day 2 of running material from the new cut. Barely 14 hours into what was supposed to be their comeback. The wash plant's main drive motor seized without warning. One moment the Trommel was spinning smoothly, processing yards of pay dirt like it was supposed to. The next moment a grinding shriek of metal on metal echoed across the site and everything stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Mitch was underneath the plant within minutes, flashlight in hand, assessing the damage. The rest of the crew stood around waiting, nobody saying much. They all knew that certain kinds of breakdowns could end a season on the spot. 20 minutes later, Mitch crawled out from under the equipment, his expression grim. Bearing cage collapsed, he announced. Probably been wearing down for weeks and finally let go. There's metal shavings all through the housing. The main shaft is scored up pretty bad. We're looking at a complete tear down. And honestly, I'm not sure this motor is salvageable. Parker felt his stomach drop. How long to get a replacement shipped up here? Best case, 8 days. Could be 10 or 12, depending on what's in stock. 8 days, maybe 12, sitting idle while the short Yukon summer burned away, watching that stockpile of pay dirt grow larger every hour with no way to process any of it, bleeding money on crew wages and equipment loans with zero gold coming out of the ground. That's not acceptable, Parker said, his voice tight. Mitch wiped grease from his hands, thinking. Then he looked up. There might be one thing. About 40 miles past where we are now, there's that old operation site, Henderson Creek area. When those guys shut down, they left most of their equipment behind, including a Trommel. A Trommel that's been sitting in the weather for how long? 8, maybe 10 years. Parker stared at him. And you think the motor might still work? I think it's the same model series as ours. I think the housing looked intact last time I drove past there. And I think it's either that or we sit here for 2 weeks watching our season disappear. Mitch shrugged. Your call. There wasn't really a choice at all. Get the flatbed hooked up, Parker said. We leave in 20 minutes. In the resurrection, the abandoned site looked like a graveyard for mining dreams. Rusted equipment sat scattered across the clearing, slowly being swallowed by vegetation that had been growing unchecked for years. Collapsed SLES runs with moss covering the riffles. Fuel tanks streaked with orange corrosion, probably leaking into the ground beneath them. Hoppers with holes eaten through the bottoms by years of weather and neglect. And sitting in the middle of it all, half hidden by brush that had grown up around its frame, was the Trommel. The drum was visibly warped from years of freeze-thaw cycles. Several panels had rusted completely through, leaving gaps big enough to fit your fist through. The whole frame leaned at an awkward angle where the ground beneath it had shifted and settled over time. But the motor housing on the back end looked intact. No obvious cracks or holes. No visible damage to the mounting brackets. "That's what we came for," Mitch said, pointing. "If the internals aren't completely seized up, we might actually have a shot here." They spent the next 4 hours working in mud and rust, fighting bolts that hadn't moved in nearly a decade. Some were so corroded they had to be cut off with a torch, sending showers of sparks into the wet grass around their boots. Others required a 4-foot breaker bar and every ounce of strength multiple crew members could apply together. Several bolt heads simply sheared off completely, forcing them to drill out the remains. Brennan sliced his palm open on a jagged piece of rusted metal and had to wrap it with electrical tape to keep working. Chris got sprayed in the face with old hydraulic fluid when a line they didn't see gave way. Tyson nearly dropped the winch cable when a mounting bracket snapped without warning. But piece by piece, bolt by bolt, they got the motor free. They winched it onto the flatbed, strapped it down tight, and headed back to the main site as fast as the rough roads would allow. That's when the real work began. The salvage motor wasn't a perfect match for their wash plant setup. Mounting brackets had different dimensions and bolt patterns. The shaft coupling needed custom adapters. The electrical connections were completely different and had to be rewired from scratch. 18 hours of continuous work followed. No sleep for anyone. Coffee pots emptied and refilled until nobody was counting anymore. Tempers running razor thin as exhaustion set in. And small setbacks started feeling like catastrophic failures. At one point, a fabricated mounting bracket that Mitch had spent 2 hours building snapped clean in half the moment they tried to torque it down. Chris threw his wrench across the work area in frustration. "This is insane. We're wasting time trying to make this garbage work. We should just shut everything down and wait for the new motor to ship." "We don't have time to wait," Parker shot back, his own patience completely gone. "Every day we sit here doing nothing is $8,000 we're not making. Either help fix this or stay out of the way." The two men stared at each other, exhaustion and frustration crackling between them. Brennan stepped into the gap, his voice calm but firm. "Everybody take 10 minutes, get some air, drink some water, then we're finishing this." Nobody argued. The crew scattered, finding quiet corners to decompress. When they came back together, the tension had dropped enough to function. For more hours of careful work, shimming, aligning, testing connections, triple-checking every bolt and bracket. "So, we've just put the harness in. Everything's pretty secured. Jenko's just jumped in the skid steer to go grab our drive shaft. So, next step is to crane our drive shaft." Finally, Mitch stepped back and looked at the reassembled powertrain. "That's it. That's everything I can do." The crew gathered around. Parker moved to the main switch, his hand hovering over the controls. "Moment of truth," Mitch said quietly. Parker flipped the switch. For a half-second, that felt like an hour. Nothing happened. Complete silence. Then the salvage motor hummed to life. The belt engaged and tensioned. The trommel drum began to turn slowly at first, then building to full operational speed. Water pressure came up. The whole wash plant was running again. The crew erupted, cheering, shouting, grabbing each other in exhausted hugs. Chris and Parker clasped hands, their argument from hours before completely forgotten. Brennan pumped his fist in the air. Tyson just stood there laughing, too tired and relieved to do anything else. That abandoned motor, the one everyone assumed was worthless scrap, had just saved their season. In the payoff, with the plant running again, the crew attacked that stockpile of pay dirt like everything depended on it, because everything did. Excavators fed material onto the hopper around the clock. The salvage motor ran continuously without a single complaint. As if it had spent the last decade just waiting for someone to give it purpose again. The crew rotated shifts to keep operations running 20 hours a day, pushing the equipment as hard as they dared. The first cleanup after repairs came in at 14.30, solid numbers, respectable production, but not spectacular. Parker kept his reaction measured as he watched Brennan work the scale. "That's a good start," he said carefully. "But one cleanup doesn't prove anything. We need to see if this ground holds up over multiple runs." The second cleanup told a different story, 19.70, nearly 40% better than the first run. The gold concentration was clearly increasing as they pushed deeper into the layer that previous miners had never reached. "They were digging for nuggets," Parker explained, holding up a pan absolutely loaded with fine gold particles. Their SLES boxes were designed to catch big pieces. Anything smaller than a match head just washed right through their system. It dropped down, settled into every crack and crevice in the bedrock and stayed there. 50 years of fine gold just sitting here, waiting for equipment that could actually recover it. The third cleanup changed everything. 26.44 ounces in a single week of processing. At current gold prices hovering around $2,300 per ounce, that single cleanup was worth over $60,000. $60,000 from ground that every miner in the Yukon had written off as completely worthless. Mitch walked over to watch the final weigh-in, still covered in grease from babysitting the salvage motor through another week of continuous operation. "Not bad for a piece of junk that was rusting in the woods," he said. A tired grin spreading across his face. Parker allowed himself a rare smile. "Not bad at all." The crew ran that cut for 3 more weeks, pulling every ounce they could before the pay layer finally started to thin out. By the time they finished, the numbers were undeniable, 83.20 total. At current market prices, that translated to just over $191,000. From an abandoned section of ground that 2 previous mining operations had walked away from using a motor salvaged from a Trommel that everyone said would never run again. The salvage motor held the ground everyone rode off, delivered beyond expectations, and Parker's season total climbed to 412, putting him within genuine striking distance of his $1 million goal. But the math remains tight. With 6 weeks left before freeze-up ends operations for the year, Parker still needs another 93 to cross that threshold. The question hanging over everything now is whether this rediscovered pay streak can sustain production or whether they've already pulled the richest material. One thing nobody can argue with anymore. That abandoned trauma motor, the one every miner in the region had dismissed as worthless scrap, saved Parker's season from disaster. And the ground that everyone walked away from decades ago just proved there's still gold hiding in places people stopped looking. The Yukon always has secrets buried beneath the surface. The only question is whether there's enough time left to find.